Hello? Yep, I got it. Thank you. All right, I appreciate your patience at the end of a long and exciting day. Okay, a long day anyway. We have, I think, about 30 minutes of content, plus or minus, for you, and then maybe some time for questions after that. And this, we've titled this the Future of the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority. And we're going to share some information about the national evaluation of that. And I'm here with my colleague from the Institute for Educational Sciences, Elizabeth Ty Wild. And she'll talk about the IES study evaluation of IADA the first 3 years. And then I've got some information to share about IADA in the short term moving forward. So that's really, and then we'll take some questions after that. So that's our agenda. I've just kind of said it. I won't take time to say it again. And I'm going to introduce Ty Wild. She's an education research scientist in the evaluation unit at IES. Before IES, she was a consultant at the Annenberg Institute, the Robin Hood Foundation, Ascendium, and served as a senior research officer at the Wallace Foundation, designing and leading evaluations of multi-site programs. And she's previously been on the faculty at Columbia's School of Public Health. So, Ty?
Thank you.
Oh, we'll just skip this. There we go.
Do you want to click or do you want me to?
Yeah,
Oh,
there you go.
Okay.
I think somebody needs to take the clicker away from me.
Well, thank you, Don. As Don said, I'm an education research scientist at the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. IES is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. We lead and manage independent evaluations of federal programs like this one about the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority, or IADA. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share the findings from the study's first report. I'll talk for around 20 minutes before handing it over to Don. There will be time for questions at the end. As you know, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act requires states to establish standards and aligned assessments in specific subjects and grades. Ideally, these assessments would measure individual students' progress towards meeting those state standards, guide classroom instruction, and hold schools accountable for the learning of their students. But the assessments haven't always accomplished these goals as well as we'd like. Congress created IADA to help address this. Many of you are probably already familiar with IADA, especially those that attended the sessions today on IADA, but just in case, I wanted to share a few key features. Up to 7 states were given the opportunity to develop and administer more useful and less burdensome assessments. IADA allows states to propose a wide variety of assessment types which can be initially tested with just a subset of students. IADA also requires all of the usual things for an accountability assessment, including stakeholder input, supports for implementation, a way to report results, and readiness to scale up statewide in 5 years. It's important to note, very important to note, that IADA provides no additional funding to states and systems, although states can use other federal sources, such as Title I assessment dollars, to offset their costs. As part of IADA, Congress mandated 2 reports. I'll share the findings from the first of those reports today. This report was actually released back in April, and if you haven't seen it yet, you can find it on our website. The first report looks at these 4 questions. First, it examines the key objectives and features of the IADA systems. Second, it measures the readiness of the systems to meet IADA goals. Third, it assesses the status of the systems in 2020-2021. That is 2 to 3 years after their start as an IADA system. And fourth, it describes the key challenges as captured in interviews with many of you, state assessment directors. Given the timing of this report, we focused on the 5 systems that initially participated in IADA. 1 from New Hampshire and 4, as you can see, from the Southeast, including 2 from Georgia. Now, moving on to our findings. The first major finding is that although the specifics of the 5 IADA systems varied, all of them sought to improve the timeliness and usefulness of their assessments for instruction, consistent with the IADA program's objectives. As you can see here, each system had an interim assessment, which could be administered more frequently than an end-of-year assessment, potentially leading to more timely access to data, which would be more relevant for instruction. All 5 systems also aim to tie the content of their assessment to recent instruction. This might mean covering less total content, but more targeted content in any one assessment. For example, the Georgia NAV-E districts chose which state academic standards to assess during a particular testing period, potentially allowing them to better align the assessments with their planned instructional pacing. We just heard about what the systems intended to do, and now we'll talk about their readiness to complete these goals. States were expected to conduct an operational assessment. That is, a trial of all IADA testing components in at least one participating school and at least one grade or subject during the first year of the demonstration authority. Of course, in order to do an operational assessment in the first year, systems needed to be well underway in their assessment development when applying. For our second finding, you'll see that some systems, in particular New Hampshire, were much closer to being able to administer an operational assessment at the start of the demonstration. As you can see here, New Hampshire has nearly all solid circles for the major preparation activities at the time of applying for IADA. As many of you know, New Hampshire had been working to develop its PACE assessment long before the state received the IADA authority. Under a special federal testing waiver, New Hampshire had administered that assessment operationally as early as 2014-15. It makes sense that they were farther along than other systems. You can see here that there are many empty or partially filled circles in other columns, which means that these systems had not fully completed these major activities by the time of applying for IADA. Georgia's NAVI system appeared to be the furthest along, aside from New Hampshire, although it still needed to combine interim assessments results into a final score and to determine each student's proficiency level. In contrast, systems such as in North Carolina and Louisiana had a bit of design and development work still to do, including building up a sufficient bank of test items before they could administer an operational assessment. Given what you've just heard about system readiness, this third finding, that the system showed limited progress in the first few years of the demonstration, may not surprise you. Remember that IADA requires participating states to be ready to adopt the new assessment system statewide after 5 years. To do so, systems had to complete a number of activities, both leading up to and following the administering of an operational assessment. Let's now take a closer look at where they might have made some inroads and where they still had a ways to go. All systems conducted some initial planning activities by 2020-2021, but with gaps. Most systems still needed to finish key steps before they could administer an operational assessment, including developing their initial items, assessment administration procedures, and providing training on the assessment. No system provided documentation suggesting that they had trained the majority of eligible educators on a set of key topics, including general information about the system, test security, accommodations, and data use. Systems also did not consistently document how items and the test item pool were selected and how the assessment addressed all the major content areas from state standards. For example, both Georgia systems still needed to complete their test and item specifications. By the end of 2020-2021, 4 of the 5 assessment systems had not yet administered an operational assessment. In the one that did, New Hampshire, they still had a number of post-administration activities to complete, including ensuring the technical quality of the resulting scores and producing score reports. The left panel shows where states were at the start, and the right panel is where they were in 2020-2021 after 2 or 3 years of implementation. As you can see, there were a lot of empty and partially filled circles at the start of IADA, and by 2020-2021, quite a few remained. Most systems were not yet advancing through major implementation activities. Our next question is, why not? And that's what we turn to in our next and final major finding. We found that while the pandemic was a universal challenge, there were also quite a few challenges that seemed important and not unique to the pandemic. Before we dig into this a little bit more, I want to acknowledge that some of these findings are based on interviews with state officials, some of whom may even be with us in this room today. So to all of you who participated, thank you for participating and supporting this research. I hope that some of these findings sound familiar. We learned that most systems face challenges recruiting and preparing districts to adopt the new system. They also face challenges in coordination and in the development of assessments and program supports. For example, 4 systems reported recruitment and coordination challenges either leading up to the IADA application or upon attempted system scale-up. These challenges seemed unrelated to the COVID-19 pandemic. We in part know this because some of these challenges were reported prior to the pandemic in 2020 and seemed to stem from how information about the assessment was disseminated and from district concerns about the extra burden or readiness to implement. For example, New Hampshire reported that some districts did not feel ready to adopt the new practices and to set aside extra time for the assessment activities. One of Georgia's systems noted misunderstandings about who would lead certain portions of the work. Other common challenges that didn't seem exclusively driven by the pandemic revolved around the capacity of states or districts in managing expectations. For example, North Carolina and New Hampshire reported challenges in developing and deploying educator professional development. And Louisiana reported challenges working with a faster than typical schedule to develop assessment items. Finally, we have to acknowledge the outsized effect that the pandemic clearly had beginning a year or 2 into the system's IADA journey. Many challenges stem from the need to cancel all assessments in spring 2020, which impeded the ability to complete critical activities, including administering an operational assessment. But given that the pandemic continued to have substantial impacts in the following school year, including continued delays in testing and in-person activities, It's no surprise that these challenges were still present through 2020-2021. For example, New Hampshire and Louisiana had to defer or cancel educator training on their IADA systems, and North Carolina and one of Georgia's systems had to cancel or delay meetings with technical advisors. And of course, understandably, the pandemic more generally diverted resources to other pressing issues and items, such as transitioning to remote or hybrid learning and addressing learning loss. I've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. Here are the key takeaways. In addition to presenting findings, in our reports, we also like to suggest some questions for our audience to consider. I'll turn to these on the next slide. Here are those questions. How are states weighing the benefits and costs of participation in IADA? 3 state systems have officially pulled out, 2 are forging ahead to do operational assessments, and 1 has joined since we began the evaluation. No doubt, the pandemic played a big role in the struggles, as we saw, but importantly, it seemed like many of the challenges would have been appeared even without COVID. It's not clear that the key incentive in IADA, not having to double test kids, is enough to convince more states to participate, which Congress seems interested in. In fact, other states are taking advantage of other SSA programs to improve assessments. Where there is funding, more time to develop assessments, and no expectation that the traditional assessment be replaced in 5 years. The next question asks, to what extent is IADA truly facilitating state innovation? The approaches these systems used aren't necessarily new, although they may be new in the context of state accountability tests. What innovative features will best serve these multiple goals of assessments that I mentioned earlier? That is, measuring individual students' progress towards meeting state standards, guiding classroom instruction, and holding schools accountable for the academic learning of their students. Finally, could other federal programs support or provide more support for IADA efforts or expansion? The Department of Education has tried a number of avenues, principally via ESEA's Title I-B assessment grants and the competitive grants for state assessments. But those funds are limited. And some challenges are probably less about having enough money and trying to use results to guide instruction. It seems to be worth considering what more would be possible to help address the challenging realities on the ground. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Congress has asked us to write a follow-up best practices report, assuming that all systems, this report was assuming that all systems had gotten farther than they have, so that we could reflect in the report on how they had succeeded. Since that hasn't played out exactly as we expected, we are pivoting somewhat to learn as best we can from current and former IADA states and other states engaged in similar efforts. In particular, we're planning to address the following questions. First, we'll look more closely at the features of IADA assessments to see what aspects seem particularly innovative. Next, we'll update each currently active IADA system since the 2020-2021 school year. And then we'll look to see what seemed to work well and also revisit the struggles once systems have had the benefit of a longer period of time to experience and reflect on the effort. To address those key questions, we're gearing up with a few major activities over the next year or so, such as collecting annual performance reports later this fall and winter, and interviewing officials in current and former IADA systems, as well as in some non-IADA states this spring. We'd also like to talk to vendors and technical advisory committee members to ensure that we're getting multiple perspectives. We might look to some of you to either participate in these conversations or refer us to the best people to talk to. We really appreciate and thank you in advance for your cooperation with this important effort, and we're expecting to publish these findings sometime in early 2025. I think I just got the hook. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present today, and now I'm going to turn it over to Don.
Thanks, Ty. Okay, so we want to spend the remaining time we have on talking about some next steps in the, I think, the near term for the IADA. I think Adam Schott, if you were at the plenary this morning, mentioned and alluded to some of these, and there's going to be more forthcoming, but I think we want to talk about a few things that we think we can share with you today. So, you know, a lot of this focus area 3 of this conference is about really taking stock on IADA. And that really began in earnest in last April when we did a request for information. And we sought feedback from folks like yourselves and 8,000 of your friends for alternative methods to establish comparability of the IADA pilot and current state assessment. Also, we had a set of directed questions about IADA timelines, and then other perceived barriers to the IADA. And so we did receive nearly 9,000 comments, actually. And the comments are available at that website there. And so there are almost 9,000 comments, and you don't have to read them all. But if you sort them by newest to oldest, you actually can see that, because 8,800 of those comments are literally duplicates from a writing campaign. So you don't need to read those, maybe read one of them. But there are 46 unique comments that are very thoughtful from groups and individuals across the country that, well, probably the duplicated comment was thoughtful too. It just was repeated 8,800 times. So I'm sorry, it's still a little traumatic for me to be flying through that. So you can read them yourselves. We're not going to try to read them to you, but just some notes about, we did read the comments and have thought about some actions that the department can take right now. So one is on IADA participation. There was an initial limitation under IADA that limited the number of states that could participate to 7. The department now believes the initial demonstration period has ended because IES has published their first report, so that period's ended. So there's no limit on the number of states that may apply to the IADA or receive the IADA. There was never a limit on how many could apply, but there was a limit on how many could participate. For applying for the IADA, so the department can control that process. And so we believe that what we're going to do is just set a regular rolling submission window where we have 2 submission windows a year. So there'll be 2 opportunities to apply for IADA. One would occur in May, and the other would occur in December. And so, for instance, a state that submitted an application in May of 2024 could potentially receive approval by August so that that state would be ready to have the authority for the 2024-25 school year. So that's the idea, that we will just have 2 application windows now and forevermore. And if a state wants to apply, they should contact us. We would appreciate some advance notice so that we can assign peer review because once we receive an application, by statute, we have 90 days to get back to the state with our feedback. So that's a pretty tight timeline. So we really do want that advance notice. So more details on that process will be coming, but there's the one big takeaway for you. We think that there's some things we can say about comparability that is really more of clarification and reminding everyone about what is required as part of comparability, at least for an IADA application. So the statute requires, right? So there's the section 1204, and we bolded the most relevant text there and I'm really talking about the alternative comparability method. Any alternative comparability method must ensure that the pilot assessment express student results or competencies in terms consistent with the aligned achievement standards under 1111B and generate results that are valid, reliable, and comparable for all students. Okay, so a way to restate that requirement is any evaluation of alignment of an IADA assessment with the state assessment must consider both the state's content and achievement standards. So in regulation, there are actually 5 ways to define comparability, from double testing students on both the innovative test and the full statewide test. There can be sampling under Part B for a demographically representative sample, and the representative sample would double test both tests. C would be including some innovative assessment items on the statewide test, and D would sort of reverse that. So it'd be trying to link the 2 tests together through some embedding of pilot test items. And then E, the alternative method, which is what we got a lot of comments about, where it's any other method outside of the first 4 that would be an equally rigorous and statistically valid comparison. And in the RFI and informally, we've heard folks want the department to provide more clarity about what that means. So we think, and was one of the comments that said very plainly that an alternative method for comparability can be based upon evidence of the alignment of both the innovative assessment and the statewide assessment to the content standards, and evidence of the consistency of achievement classifications across the 2 systems, which is really what we were just saying on the previous slide about content and achievement standards. So that those are the essential elements we think to a good comparability evaluation for an IADA pilot. So a note that we'd like to make for you is that states are describing a plan for establishing comparability. The department does not expect that states will have established comparability for their IADA pilot. They're submitting a plan describing how they will demonstrate comparability. And so it is expected that the plan show potential to satisfy the statute and regulations. But again, it's not expected that states will have established the comparability. And we have said this about 100 times at this conference, but I think we'll say it again. The states do not have to show comparability at the individual score level. This is about the achievement level classifications that are used in accountability. So the achievement levels, the proficiency, levels of proficient, levels of basic, levels advanced. That's the level at which comparability should be demonstrated. We thought of a couple examples that we could offer that demonstrate an alternative method of establishing comparability. One is from an IADA state, and it's from New Hampshire, which as part of their comparability approach, they used what they described as a non-concurrent method. And I'm going to greatly simplify, and so Carla and Scott promised not to throw anything at me because I'm going to greatly simplify their work here. But the state compared the results of kids who took a grade 3 reading test in 17-18, and then those next year, those kids took a grade 4 PACE, the IADA assessment, in 18-19. And they compared the achievement levels of that cohort of students across the 2 years. And what their findings indicated were that the results demonstrated remarkable consistency of expectations for the same students, as we would expect some growth to proficiency from one year to the next. And so New Hampshire found positive, moderate correlations between the state test and PACE, which they thought was noteworthy given the intentional differences in design and purpose of the assessments. And so there's a very small link. You can actually open their APR from that year and read all of the comparability evidence. We just sampled it. But the idea is this is a way that a state demonstrated comparability without double testing any students. Okay? And it looked okay. I mean, we did not have a reaction to that APR and call New Hampshire and tell them to stop. Okay, we didn't do that. We thought that looked okay, you know. So there is a way to do the alternative method of comparability, you know, using an IADA example. Another example is you have to think outside the box with me a little bit here. It's not from the IADA, but it is within our system of peer review that we provide for states for evaluating assessments. It's a very specialized example. You may know that states have the option of allowing districts to use a nationally recognized high school test in place of their regular high school test. So it's a district selected option. We have some requirements that have to be attended to in order to receive approval to do that. And we have 3 states that have that permission, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Mississippi. And so they have gone through the process to establish comparability between the nationally recognized high school assessment and the regular statewide assessment. And so there's a citation there. It's in our peer review critical element 7.3, which is one we normally don't talk about because it's only used in this case. And so we cite where you can find it in our assessment peer review guide. But what it says is that in order, what we ask states to do in that demonstration is to show that the nationally recognized high school assessment is equivalent to or more rigorous than the statewide assessment with respect to content coverage, difficulty, overall quality, and other aspects that the state may establish in its technical criteria, and produce valid and reliable data on student academic achievement. So in other words, show that they are comparable in terms of achievement classification. There are ways to do that, different ways to approach. I think all 3 states probably looked at multiple types of evidence. The idea is there's a framework of some criteria there that might also inform someone looking to establish an alternative method of comparability. We obviously haven't tried that. We don't know how, but we think this has potential because it has the elements, remember, compare the content alignment and compare the alignment of the achievement standards. That, I think, are the essentials that need to be attended to in the comparability demonstration. That's, I think, a point we want to make, and we may say it a few more times here at the conference. I think there are 2 sessions on comparability tomorrow, they'll probably say words to this effect anyway. So we want to talk about funding opportunities. There's been a lot of talk. So in the last two competitions for the CGSA program, which was 2020 and 2022, we provided grants that support IADA planning and implementation, or IADA-like planning and implementation, and a lot of grants to support new types of assessment designs. The purpose of CGSA is to enhance the quality of assessments used by states for measuring academic achievement. So all of the CGSA program, all of the statutory uses are very well aligned with states that want to pursue IADA type work. So we just want to mention that. And so in particular, there were a total of 13 projects. If we look at innovative item types, design work, planning, IADA implementation, for over $35 million across those two competitions. This year, well, it was fiscal year 2023, Congress appropriated $20.9 million, and those funds will be awarded before September 30th, 2024. So a competition for that money for the CGSA is forthcoming, okay? And we will provide more information when that competition is ready to be announced to the public, all right? So we would be remiss if we didn't say there is another, round of CGSA that's going to be available, and it can support this kind of work. I mentioned I was in the previous IADA session. We talked about peer reviewers. We are always seeking additional experts to serve as a peer reviewer of state assessment systems for IADA applications and CGSA applications. So there's a couple of links on this slide that show the application, and the application form actually has the return email address to send. So you fill out the application form and also provide a copy of a resume. If you're not interested in being a peer reviewer, although there's actually a lot of peer reviewers in this room right now, if you know someone who is, please send this along to them. So this is an open call. We just accept these on a rolling basis. So that's the end of our content, and we're wondering if there's any questions, but only if they're for Ty. I don't know, there's a couple microphones if people want to step up, or I don't speak QR code, so our subject matter experts were better than me. They have QR codes, but I didn't do that. So, questions? Really? Anyone? 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 Bueller? All right, so a cultural reference to the 1980s. Well, thank you, and we will see you tomorrow. We will be here in the room to answer any individual questions for about 15 more minutes, if no one has any. Thanks very much.